All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015. We're coming to the very end of Chapter 18, which is how to use model binding with the entity framework. We're up to page 688 in the section that is entitled How to Use Data Annotations to Validate Data. And the author mentions here that rather than creating an entity data model that you can work with in the entity designer, you can create it using a feature of the entity framework called Code First Development. When you use Code First Development, you can work with the entity data model only in the code editor. Many developers prefer this because it gives them more control over how the model works. It also can make it easier to understand how the entity framework, or EF, enforces validation. The author mentions, I'm on page 688 here, once you understand that, you can customize the validation so that it works the way you want. That's true whether you work with a model in the designer or in the code itself. So what you see in this figure here is it shows you how to create an entity data model. So previously we used the EF designer, and that's what 90% of the chapter was about. But at the end, they're talking about using the fours. Remember, they're not discussing these two. So they're talking about using the code first. All right, once you do that, then step 2 allows you to set up a connection and the database objects that you want to use. All right. You don't choose the version of the entity framework you want to use as we did previously. This was the same, but this, here we jump right to that without asking which version of the EF you want to use. And that's because the Code First automatically uses the most current release of Entity Framework 6 by default. When you click the Finish button here, the Entity Framework creates a C# class file for the object context, as well as individual C# class files for each database object selected. Again, you'll notice here we've selected 2 objects, those being categories and products. So the entity framework will create a file named Halloween.cs for the object context, a file named category.cs for the categories table, and a file named products.cs for the products table. The categories.cs and products.cs are like business classes that we've talked about throughout the book, except that they include data annotation that provide for validation. And they're starting to show right here. Now, as mentioned here, this table shows some of the data annotation attributes that you can use to set validation rules for the properties in an entity class when you use Code First. The EF includes some of these data annotation attributes by default. For example, the code example in the figure shows the attributes that are added by default to the name property. The required property is also added because the database column doesn't accept null values. The string attribute is used to indicate the maximum number of characters that can be stored in a column. Now, see that there are actually 6 attributes. Compare, which compares 2 properties. Concurrency check, which specifies that a property participates in optimistic concurrency checking. Key, which is 1 or more properties that uniquely identify an entity. Range, which specifies a numeric range constraints for the value of a property. Required, which specifies that a property is required. And string length, which has the minimum and maximum number of characters allowed. The data validation attributes are stored in the system.componentModel.dataAnnotation namespace. Okay, and because of that, the using directive for this namespace is included in the class. I think we see that. Thought we saw it in here. Maybe they just don't show it in the example. So these annotations are used by the code analysis feature of what's called the Team Foundation Server, or TFS. If you're not using TFS, you can delete the annotations. You can also customize the annotations that the entity framework generates. When you use code first, you can't update the model with changes made to the database like you can in the designer. However, you can achieve the same effect by deleting the generated class files, then following the steps that are shown in the figure here. So when you use code first, the entity framework generates classes that include data annotation attributes that provide for validation. Again, you can customize these attributes and you can store them in a separate class file so they're not overwritten if you regenerate the class files from the database. You can also add data annotation attributes to entity classes that you work with in the designer by storing them in a separate class file. So that was very short, I understand that, but as I mentioned, in my humble opinion, this is the hardest chapter in our textbook. So they do rewrite this. Okay, they show this is how to modify the product receipt application. This is a code first application that they show in there. Okay. In this particular chapter, and again, this ends section 3 of our text. All right. We have discussed the entity data model. We saw how to create it from an existing database. We saw how to work with the entity designer or entity model designer. And we did that too. We worked with the entity model. We looked quite a bit at LINQ, which is the line integrated query, or line item query. I think it's line integrated query. We used the link to entities to retrieve data from one or more database tables. We were always just grabbing it from a table at a time. We looked at how to use the entity framework to add, modify, and delete rows in a database table. We looked a little bit at model binding and how you use that to display, update, insert, and create. In other words, how to use the CRUD operations in a bound control. Remember, the key thing here is we were linking right to the model. We weren't linking to a data source. We didn't have one in here. You don't when you use the entity framework. We talked about how to provide for handling concurrency and data validation exceptions. We looked at using a data access class with model binding. We looked at a lot of the terminology for the entity data model, including context, entity class, scalar property, navigation property, and association. We talked about the differences between lazy loading, loading just what you need, and eager loading, loading everything. We explained how you can provide for concurrency when using the entity framework. Talked a little bit about how model binding works. Talked about what it means for a data control to be strongly typed and the benefits of that. And finally, we ended up by talking about code first. All right, that ends again section 3 of the text. Section 4, which will be chapters 19, 20, 21, and 22. It's kind of a miscellaneous, where chapter 19 will talk about how to secure an application. Chapter 20 will be on authentication and authorization. Chapter 21 on email, custom error messages, and how to deal with a back button. And chapter 22, which is on how to deploy an application. So I'll be back to talk about those chapters in just a few minutes.